the Republicans funded ICE and Border Patrol to a level more than the United States Marines.
That's right. That's right.
More than the Israeli military.
Yep.
Last May, federal agents in tactical gear stormed a small Italian restaurant in my district where they were preparing for the dinner rush. They threw the owner against a wall. They handcuffed the employees. And when the neighbors came outside to see what was happening, agents deployed flashbang grenades. All of this to arrest 4 dishwashers, not drug kingpins, not dangerous felons. Since then, we've seen ICE raids at schools, churches, and courthouses. DHS agents shot and killed 2 American citizens in Minneapolis, and the Secretary of Homeland Security was fired after spending $220 million of our tax dollars on self-promotional ads. Meanwhile, economists are telling us that mass deportation will raise the average family's grocery bill by $30 a week and add $48,000 to the cost of a new home. Food prices could rise 14.5%, and construction costs could climb over 6%. At a time when families are already struggling with inflation, these policies will make it worse and not better. Immigrants in this country generated $14.5 trillion more in taxes than they received in benefits over the last 30 years. They are not draining our economy. They are holding it up. I'm Scott Peters. I represent San Diego's 50th Congressional District, and this is 72 and sunny, where we have the conversations that matter about the challenges and opportunities shaping our region and our country. If you like what you hear, subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts. My guest today is Todd Schulte, the president of Forward US, one of the leading bipartisan immigration advocacy organizations in the country. Todd has spent over a decade making the economic and moral case for immigration reform, and his team has produced some of the best and most important research on what the current enforcement crackdown actually costs American families. We're going to talk about what's happening on the ground, what it is doing to our economy, and what a better immigration system would look like. Todd, welcome. So Todd, thanks so much for coming. You're based in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
You've been in California and were kind enough to find your way down to San Diego. Really appreciate you coming.
Well, I mean, it's a huge sacrifice to come to San Diego, as you know. But no, it's great. We do a lot of work in the state and in Southern California and San Diego. And really just appreciative of your leadership over the many years. So
Thank you. Before we start, why don't you just tell us a little bit about Forward US and how you got engaged in that?
Yeah, so I came to this work as somebody who'd worked in politics on campaigns. I had worked for a member of the House who was a Democrat. And to me, really the important thing when it comes to public policy, when it comes to politics is, how do you use government to make life better for as many people as possible? And having grown up, having then worked on the Hill, this long failed immigration system was something that to me cried out for where, like, yes, there are things we can all do individually, and that's so important. But ultimately, the sorts of reforms we're going to need are ones where Congress and the executive branch are going to have to work together. And so just over a decade ago, this organization started with really the idea that immigrants and immigration are good for America and Americans. And so we should work across ideological spectrums with all sorts of stakeholders, the business community, immigrants' rights, dreamers and doctors, and how do we build the policy and political momentum to ultimately have a better immigration system. We've done a lot of things over the last decade. Things have gone well. We've had setbacks, but I'm so thankful to get to work with an awesome team around the country of people who are really deeply working towards the belief that a better immigration system is good for immigrants here today, immigrants in the future, and all Americans. And so it's great to be here.
Well, the topic's front and center right now. I think we really do listen to you when we talk about how to reform this. But let's start by talking about what's happening on the ground. You probably know, I think one of the first incidents that came up even before LA was in San Diego. We had this Italian restaurant, Bona Forchetta. It's actually pretty good pizza for San Diego, I must say. It is a small family-run restaurant, and 20 ICE agents come in, fully with machine guns. And I always say that if you saw them coming into Bona Forchetta, you probably thought that El Chapo or some drug kingpin was at the bar. But no, they took out 4 guys who just trying to make a living for their families, and the dishwashers or busboys, just sort of kitchen work, and took them away. Didn't make the the place any safer. It terrorized the people in the restaurant. It terrorized the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And-
By design.
right. And
Yeah.
it's the kind of thing that we're starting to see. We saw that after that, we saw Los Angeles, things like that. So what's this? Let's talk about Minneapolis in a second.
Yeah.
But short of that, like what are we seeing around the country in terms of these kind of abductions and deportation?
I think it's such an important thing to start kind of back about a year ago where we started to see more and more of this. So, just to take a step back, you hear words like undocumented immigrant a lot. That basically means someone who doesn't have the ability in most cases to adjust status. They either came here unlawfully or they came here on a legal visa and they don't have valid ability to work. And
The visa expired and they
in about half the cases the visa expired, and half the cases they came here. The vast majority of undocumented immigrants have been here for a really long time, particularly here in Southern California. You were talking about people who came in the 90s. I talked to somebody last week who came in the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, and they are still stuck, right? There's no ability for them to get right with the law. There's no line to get into. And sometimes people find their way to some sort of a temporary status here. But, as we go through and see the city by city, the first thing I want to say is there isn't a good immigration enforcement regime. And there's 12 or 14 million people who don't have the ability to go through a process and get right with the law. And so, about a year ago, you started to see...
12 to 14 million people are here. They're considered undocumented.
That's right.
However they got here, their papers have expired or they don't.
Yeah, and that includes people who have some sort of a temporary status, TPS, temporary protected status, DACA, yeah. But, it's people who don't have kind of a quasi-permanent or permanent status. And I think that's just important to understand. You're not talking about people who in most cases want to be in this situation. And they are locked out of the ability because of a long failed immigration
They
system.
like to have papers.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, sure.
I mean, and, it's something where we have an immigration system that hasn't been really fundamentally overhauled since 1990. It's really built on the backbones of a system from 1965. So think about what San Diego was like in 1990 or in 1965. Think about the global economy. And think about how much things have changed since then, but we haven't really updated our immigration laws. And so, okay, that's like the big picture. How does that show up? Well, Donald Trump comes back into power and they start to say, we want to go into communities. We want to make sure that we are using, a ever expanding immigration enforcement system. We could talk in a bit about how much money they've put into this. Two, they want to use kind of this all of government approach, which we'll talk about, where you're seeing everybody, I live in Washington, D.C. with the park police now do immigration enforcement. But also we're going to go to all these places and we're going to scare people. And that's how you end up starting to see this. And so you first saw this in cities around the country. We talked about San Diego.
Talk about what you mean by deployment. So
Yeah.
you're sending in people from
Kind of
ICE, from Border Patrol,
Exactly.
and then
and then
sometimes the military.
sometimes the military, yeah.
Yes, I see in the metro station in DC, you see
Right.
3 Marines. I felt so bad for them. They don't sign up for this kind of duty. They're watching people commute to work.
That's right. And so what you saw when we talk about these deployments is this kind of these big pronouncements by the president of the United States. He uses a lot of harmful rhetoric. And the first one of those was in Southern California. And so they send in ICE. Now, ICE is getting a lot larger, and it is quite large,
Right.
but they don't just send in ICE. And ICE is, the way to think about this is ICE has historically done a lot of the kind of the front end kicking down of doors, immigration enforcement in the United States.
So just to go back
Yeah.
there. So for people who don't deal with that, what was ICE doing, say, in the Biden or
Yeah.
pre-Trump 2 administration? What would be their appropriate role?
Yeah. So what ICE had done, and this goes in and out, but I think a kind of a brief history is after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security is founded, and immigration enforcement gets lumped in both in terms of at the border, which is CBP or Customs and Border Protection. Those are the people who you can think about have historically worked at the border. So, 30 miles south of here at San Ysidro, but also near the border. Okay. That is a much larger agency historically than ICE.
Right.
ICE is the second agency that works inside the United States historically. They have at various points and in various states, they work often with, in some places, there's different arrangements with local law enforcement. I think one of the things we're most concerned about now is this huge expansion of immigration enforcement into and through the criminal justice system.
But what's enforcement look like, though?
But so enforcement in the Biden administration, for example, the overall numbers of people being arrested who were kind of longstanding residents inside the United States went quite down under the Biden administration. It actually started to go down in the last 2 years of President Obama's administration. It stayed low under Trump historically compared to actually where it had been, in part because a lot of states passed good policies to limit how much local law enforcement did there. But that changed rapidly in 2025. And so this kind of all of government approach in which ICE would be a tip of the spear, but they would bring in the National Park Police, Border Patrol, U.S. Marshals. The IRS has police who now do immigration enforcement in Washington, D.C.
They're not doing taxes.
They're definitely, no, I mean, you can see this.
People aren't paying their taxes.
They have, I don't want to give anybody any ideas for watching, but they have moved agents off of tax enforcement for high net worth individuals and on to immigration enforcement. So you mentioned like the kingpin earlier, for example. Well, like the person who is supposed to be looking at the kingpin's international accounting and money laundering is now probably, in some cases, been reassigned to go around and check somebody's papers. And you know, I just think people should understand, like, what everyone wants to think about the size and scope of law enforcement in this country and what that should be here. Part of this has been this very deliberate effort to shift resources towards going into the back of kitchens and terrorizing.
And just talk about the amount of resources in the big, beautiful bill.
That's right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we funded, the Republicans funded ICE and Border Patrol to a level more than the United States Marines.
That's right. That's right.
More than the Israeli military, which is obviously very active. And having big, it's a big military. It's not a and we've turned those forces loose on our own country.
That's right.
This is the analogy I use. I'm just telling you, I think this is fair. So, in the city of San Diego, there are uncollected speeding tickets, and that's wrong. It's illegal. You should pay your speeding ticket.
Yeah.
It would be within the power of the police department to decide, we're going to enforce those speeding tickets. We're going to go to your house. We're going to knock on your door. We're going to bring guns. We're going to apply a ton of resources to speeding tickets. I mean, it sort of strikes me that this is a prioritization that's, it's maybe legal in a sense, in a budgeting sense, but it's absolutely misses the mark. And it's just crazy in terms of how you allocate resources.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one way to think about this is even to take it a step further, and we'll get to Minneapolis in a bit, but actually like using U.S. citizen children to entrap the people who in this case are a speeding ticket here. I mean, I want people to maybe take a step back and go back to last spring. At the same time you were seeing this in Los Angeles, you saw a really high profile case of about 200 Venezuelans who were abducted through what's called the Alien Enemies Act. No due process, but you also saw a man called Kilmar Garcia, who people probably have heard of, who was taken off the streets and was sent to Venezuela. So it's a year plus later. Kilmar Garcia, there's been federal court ruling after federal court ruling. The government admitted they were wrong. They are still on this all of government approach to do everything they can to go after. This is somebody who was just working outside of Home Depot. And to go back for a second on, because I want to talk about, what happened here in Southern California. You have seen this approach where the White House said, go to Home Depots. The White House has said, go to restaurants.
Go to schools.
And be outside schools and terrify people here. And we're now actually seeing an assault on not just in-state tuition for undocumented kids, but an effort to go after access to K-12 education.
And healthcare facilities. And by the way,
please.
Yesterday I heard was visiting with some, yesterday it was reported that they're outside of the Marine Corps graduation ceremony in South Carolina, where people are signing up. Now you have to have status to be in the military, but your parents might not.
That's right.
So they're signing up to serve the country, and then ICE would be outside to scoop up your parents.
Yeah. It is something where I think at a high level, if you think about the big levers they're pulling, so they're ramping up enforcement through every means necessary, including this reconciliation bill, which you'd mentioned, which I'll come back to. They're taking away status from people who have it. They're trying to take away basic rights. You can't get housing. You can't get a driver's license. You can't go to a hospital. We've seen in Texas, people aren't going to the doctors as much.
Yeah.
They're going to be sicker. So then they can turn around and say, oh, these immigrants are sick. Taking like basic due process. And then they turn around and you see this propaganda machine, which you saw in these city by city deployments. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. It is like I want to be like careful with the words I use, but like it is a xenophobic colored video game trailer that we saw. So
one other perverse thing I think is really awful is that you get people picked up at the appointments that they're set up to follow the rules.
That is right.
You're trying to follow the rules. You're trying to show up, trying to do the right thing. You get an appointment for an interview to get your green card or whatever the next step is. And that's where they pick you up.
And that's not even included in the budget we talked about here. So you are turning courthouses over into the very process by which, you hear, oh, we'll get to the back of the line. And to go back to your point before, just to understand how big of an expansion we're living through right now, because there's this big DHS funding fight, people demand about the airports. On this party line vote last year, they voted to increase the size of immigration enforcement in the United States to something that is basically the size of the 6th or the 7th biggest military in the world on an annual basis.
Trying it against ourselves.
Inside the United States, yes. Number one. Number two, they've tried to pre-fund this for multiple years, which to get like very boring and technical, it's 72 and sunny, so I don't want to do like a Pizzeria jargon too much.
We're good looking and we're smart.
Exactly. But this is not a normal thing that the government does. They don't triple or quadruple or 500% increase your budget and then pre-fund it here. And then they have gutted any sort of oversight there. So you're hearing things like, words like mega warehouse jails.
Yeah.
In Social Circle, Georgia, which is a kind of ex-urban quasi-rural part of Georgia here, they're currently trying to take an old warehouse and turn it into a jail that would hold 12,500 people. That is twice the size of currently the biggest jail in the United States, which is Rikers Island. And I want to be really clear, we've worked to get rid of Rikers and that
not a paragon of
exactly. But we
modern
are talking about
policing or
exactly. But we are talking about doubling the size of that with much worse conditions here. Also that we can, I just want to be clear, deport as many people as possible. And for those that the government doesn't have the ability to find and arrest and jail, they want to terrify them.
Well, let's go back. One more thing about that. So what's your data on so obviously we hear stories about people are now afraid to go outside. Mm-hmm. So the people want to take their kids out.
Yeah.
Do you have data on that? Like what's the quantitative effect of this fear that they've been spreading among immigrants and even people who are legal?
That's right.
But may look like immigrants.
So a couple things there. One, in Los Angeles and in Charlotte and in New Orleans, where they kind of went city by city for these deployments here, you saw school district attendance drop 25, 30, 45% in a number of core schools here. And then you see this, far right people try to be like, well, they shouldn't have been there. That means they shouldn't have been there. Well, first off, one, we're talking about kids, and kids, regardless of immigration status, should be in schools. And two, no, we're talking about, to your point, people who are like very rightly worried about racial profiling. Yeah. Racial profiling that is in some ways has not just been pushed forward by this administration, but frankly greenlit by the Supreme Court here. So
the Kavanaugh stops.
Exactly. So let's be clear here. We're talking about it is an intentional government effort to push kids out of schools, to not have kids get health care, to destabilize their housing here. So then what happens? So, okay. So like we just went through a pandemic when 14 and 15-year-old kids, 18-year-old kids maybe don't go to school. What happens? They're out of the street. They're into trouble. And then you say, aha, we told you in the first place. That is why your sheriff's department and that is why your local law enforcement not only needs to do immigration enforcement, needs to get bigger and bigger. Yeah. We need to fill those jails that we're filling with people there. And so one thing we think about is how these kind of big systems get bigger together. And it's the thing we're really worried about right now as we're seeing, I'm going to throw these numbers out, a 300, 500, 400% annual increase in the amount of money going into these systems here. It's really scary stuff.
When people don't have health care and everything else.
Exactly.
Let's talk about what enforcement looked like in Minneapolis. This is the kind of thing where, as I watched it, it was obviously horrific and tragic that Renee Good and Alex Preddy lost their lives in this way. It almost strikes me as surprising that we don't see more of it the way this is going on. To me, it's untrained people who are not trained, who are, maybe a little too full of macho and get a sense of power and are just the wrong people in the wrong place, in the wrong role. What's your take on that? Has that scared the administration into anything different, or how do you think that? What do you want to say about Minneapolis?
Yeah, I mean, to work backwards from the last point, I do think as a result of, something like 150,000 people in Minneapolis doing a training and showing up for their neighbors, and millions of people around the country standing up.
Yeah.
You have seen this huge shift in public opinion. You have seen this huge effort by the administration to basically backpedal off of this one particular tactic, which I'll talk about here. I think it's, we've been involved in these surging into different cities here, and as bad as things were and have been and continue to be in a lot of places, the size and scope of like what happened in Minneapolis is actually pretty hard to understand. So the mayor there, I think, gave a pretty jarring statistic. Yeah, someone said, well, would you arrest federal law enforcement if they broke the law? And he said, well, there's two things. One, that is a really bad situation. If we find ourselves in where local police are attempting to arrest federal police, that leads to some pretty tough places pretty quickly. And he said that. The second thing he said was, we're outnumbered 5-1.
Right.
They're
right.
I want to
in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
This is a big city. This is a city that has
right.
Look, we have like big police forces in the United States compared to most every other country. We then surged in 3,600 federal agents doing immigration enforcement into a city where there was about 600 police officers here. So just to like give you a sense of what that felt like. So what did it feel like on the ground? One, I think when we talk about pushing money through like all these systems together, look, I want to be clear that like the first people who are going to be hurt by this like are Todd Schulte and Scott Peters, naturally. But also you did get to a point in Minneapolis where there was like two like white people showing up to protest who got killed. It's just like absolutely like this should be very clear where this can end up. We should obviously stop a war short of this. You have people who are being told that their job is to spread fear and to be provocative. You are being told that not just the immigrants or the people around them, regardless of immigration status, which I'll come back to, but the people, their neighbors who are showing up for them are the actual problem. And I think you see that undergirding a lot of this xenophobic attitude.
Yeah.
It is actually like the allies of the immigrants who are like the true problem.
They're trying to scare us about each other.
Yes, and that infects people's thinking on this. What I think you saw in Minneapolis was arguably maybe the biggest kind of mutual aid, neighbor-to-neighbor support operation. People who were manning patrols all night long outside of a jail where people were being released. The government was releasing people in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the dead of night in negative 15-degree wind chill with no clothing.
Yeah.
And so people stepped up in an amazing way. And I think, to me, like that is the such an important lesson here. So much of the leadership of the energy you're seeing is from people who are saying, I want to show up for my neighbors. I want to show up and say, I don't want that Amazon fulfillment center to be turned into a private prison.
Right.
And I think a lot what we try to do is just give people the tools of all the ways that they can engage in public policy and just neighbor-to-neighbor work.
And since we're back to Minneapolis, I want to make sure that I stepped on your point a little bit. You want to say there was a particular tactic that that they've stopped doing as a result of the two murders.
Yes. So you've seen this, I use this term, but this kind of like federal like surge or like city-to-city deployments where they were going in and, they would do this huge surge of resources and where you all of a sudden have more federal immigration enforcement agents in cities than there were, kind of all government officials combined. Sometimes that was, you hear within cities, but it was actually often within like neighborhoods within cities. So you heard about Chicago. It was not all of Chicago. It was kind of parts of the northwest suburbs. I don't think it's a coincidence to say this often also happens around areas where there is a kind of a more affluent, educated workforce in places like Evanston, Illinois, where like people did an unbelievable job fighting back against this. But like where it's worked well is when you've seen policymakers step up and say, have a united front and say, we may not agree on everything, but we're against this.
Right.
In my hometown of DC, it does not work as well. It didn't happen here. But this, I don't know how to jump out, kill squad approach is one that you've seen them pull back on. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it leaves us in three big places. Number one, they are going to do everything they can to surge money to coerce and force all these other government agencies to do immigration enforcement. There's these called 287G agreements. They basically are different ways in which local law enforcement has to do immigration enforcement. They have expanded the number of these by 1,000% in the first year. Two, they are going to try to build a lot more jails to put people in. Many of them will be run for profit. Some of them exist already. They're trying to expand. A lot of your colleagues are doing work right now actually to close down what's called Dilly. This is a family jail. Congressman Jacobs, Woman Jacobs was down there with others recently. A lot of colleagues have gone down there. And so you are both seeing efforts to put pressure on that. And also, as they try to build these new ones, you're actually seeing bipartisan pushback against this, kind of really across the country. So that expansion of this, and that's so important because once you build these facilities, there's a saying which is like, if you build it, you fill it. And then it becomes, and this is not good, a job creation.
Right.
Like, and here in California,
you got people who are invested in that.
They're invested in it. There's bond payments on it.
Right.
Their school district is paid for it by tax dollars here. This infrastructure builds up. And so, what you've seen is in places like the South, where over the last 25 years, under both Democratic and Republican efforts, people have been able to really safely reduce the numbers of prisons and jails in the traditional criminal justice system. What ended up happening was ICE turned back around and started leasing that space out.
Right.
So that's the second thing we're really concerned about. The third is this effort to use the banality of really awful paperwork to hurt a lot of immigrants. So the biggest thing, one big thing is taking away status from people who have it. Millions of people who have a status are trying to take it away from, or make it not worth very much. I mean, student visas, H-1Bs are, making harder to renew.
H-1Bs is the ones you use to come work for a company.
Exactly. So you're, a high wage employer. You graduate from U.S. university. Green cards aren't worth as much. Like everything is worth less. Trying to take away all these rights. And so
also, even if you have a green card, they pick you up and scare the hell out of you.
Yeah. I mean,
so that word gets out.
I think one way to think about this is they want to tell a story that they are constantly lifting up someone who they are like, look at this person, they've done something bad, or look at this person, they've done something bad, and or they are from a country that we want to demagogue, which we talked about. And then they want to use that to paint a picture for an entire population.
Right, yeah.
But what they're really doing is everything is worth less. So it's not like, it kind of betrays the whole lie here to me. It's not, we shouldn't be having a question about like, or let me put it this way. What they end up doing is when they talk about, you see the mug shot of somebody, they want to scare people here, but it's not just that they're going after all undocumented immigrants. They're going after all undocumented immigrants, and they're going after people who have a revocable status. I mean, they're going after, they won't actually right now say they're trying to end the Dreamer Protection Program, DACA, but they're saying it's not really worth much.
Right, yeah.
And then they're saying, well, we want the best and the brightest here, the president says, but they're slashing employment, basically, immigration. Again, they're saying, oh, well, like the true refugees, but the entire refugee program is South Afrikaners. People who have a green card, a legal permanent resident, it's just, they're saying it's not worth much. They're talking about even denaturalization. And so everything up the ladder, including to then, we talked about this before, the fear that U.S.-born citizens who may be Latino, they may be Asian American, they may be Black, have a racial profiling, everything gets shifted back in that direction here as we put more money in and we grow this apparatus.
One more point about enforcement that I've been working on is with the Afghan community. We have these folks, this happened in Philippines that have been in Vietnam, where we have people from other countries who help our troops.
Yeah.
The Filipinos who helped us in World War II ultimately got citizenship.
Yep.
We ultimately took care of the Vietnamese who took care of us in the Vietnam War. We have translators and other folks who are Afghans who put their lives at risk to save our soldiers and Marines. And I think reasonably thought that we would keep our promise to take care of them. But they've been caught up in this same, frankly, xenophobic, racist kind of response too. So and what happened was this argument by example that you talked about. One guy got a hold of a gun and did a horrible crime, and that guy should be punished, but he's an Afghan, so they blamed all Afghans. They ascribed this behavior to all Afghans. And now you've got a situation where the program to get these folks visas, to get them safe from the Taliban, has been stopped.
Yeah.
And they're talking about being deported, and no one will ever trust us again. No one will ever trust us again when we ask for help overseas.
Yeah, and I just think about what's happening now. And we don't have to go into details, but there was like a week there where it seemed like the president's plan was to like inspire, he was saying to the people.
Rise up in Iran, you mean? Yeah.
Like, what? I'm sorry, I won't curse, but like, what are we, like, come on, like,
right.
I mean, I just think people should take really seriously the incredible lessons and harms that people learning there, number one. Number two, I think that there is this really, really nasty lie at the heart of the stuff with Afghanistan, where just it sounds ridiculous. It is the position of the United States government that
I know what you're saying.
Venezuela was like an existential threat to the United States, that Iran is an existential threat to the United States, that Afghanistan was an existential threat to the United States. And also it is the position of this United States government that it's completely safe to return people who translated for the American Armed Forces, people who fought the Taliban, and their women, their daughters, and their wives, if they're men, to the Taliban. That is legal representation of it that's being made in our name right now. And you see those sorts of just contradictions and lies across their logic here. So yeah,
it's awful. I'll tell you, let's talk one more thing about enforcement.
Yeah.
I did, just because back in November, we saw this coming, and I introduced a bill called Stop Excessive Force in Immigration.
Yep.
And the idea is just to hold ICE and Border Patrol in our cities to the same standard that we would expect of local police, local sheriffs, state police, who are trained and know how to do things. So in other words, you get a certain amount of training, not 47 days. I think that's the right number because of the name of the number of the president. He made training 47 days. Maybe that's a legend, but
perfect,
probably true. But always on body cameras. They're learning how to de-escalate conflict, and to respond with proportionally to threats, not to kill someone who's driving away from you in a car.
Right.
Those and have identification, not wear masks, just the same we'd expect of local law enforcement who do a great job for us keeping us safe. That's the kind of approach we might want to see from the Trump administration. I don't see a sign that they're going to give up on this sort of secret police Gestapo kind of style.
Yeah, you mentioned masking. We haven't talked about it yet. I think it's challenging because it feels ridiculous that is even a thing that needs to be debated. But it is, and I hope people haven't had to see this too much. And there are obviously.
Is the doxing thing is that people say they're going to dox, give us our personal information out if we don't have a mask?
The best thing I can say to understanding where this actually is you have seen this administration say they have to, they have to wear a mask because of that's going to be doxed. And then last week, the president was like, well, when you go to airports, take your mask off. As if people, I don't know if people have ever been to an airport recently, but people have phones at airports, is what I would say. Again, this is they're just kind of portraying lies too. You've seen this, people haven't seen this. At first, it was the number of threats to agents have doubled and tripled and now I think it's up 1,100 or 11,000%. I'm not really sure which one. But in writing, the Department of Justice contradicted the administration, said it's up 300%. And again,
the 300%.
300% of what, number one. And two, I don't know what the baseline is. I don't know what the truth is. But what I can say is that when the government was doing something under penalty of perjury, it actually said the government was lying by 75%. So I think there's a lot of places where it's a little bit like, where's the floor right now? And it feels both so important to be like, there have to be some things that you feel like they are, this is like an 80-20 issue. Like, we've pulled this, the idea that like you should not have identifiable agents here is just kind of ridiculous here. And also, I think we should ask our questions very seriously, why the administration won't even move on that.
Yeah. Or even like, trade us federal protections, say doxing is a federal crime, do something like that. And that's a concern.
They have been against that.
Yeah.
They seem extremely intent on, and look, I think part of this is
they want what they want.
Yeah. And the president has different instincts than some of his staff on policy at times. I go back to actually, I think one of the things that to me was really interesting about how I learned about the president, which is in the first term, he went to Long Island, and he did one of these appearances that he's giving a political speech in front of like armed agents of the state, in this case police officers, and he like turns back and he does the like, you should rough them up and like bump their heads in when you might have been there. I do think that is something where outside of the particular policy architecture, I think the president likes the idea of having people who work for him with guns using violence until like they got too much bad press for him with Greg Bovino, and then under the bus, Greg Bovino guns.
By the way, he doesn't mind what happens to them. He's only concerned about himself. And speaking of the
it's a CR issue.
We've switched now from one of my former colleagues, Christy Nome, to another of my former colleagues, Mark Wayne Mullen.
Yeah.
Does that strike you that there will be any kind of change from that?
I mean, I think there's let me tell you where I think there's going to be some changes. There's definitely going to be some changes, it seems like, on procurement policies there, and it would seem on perhaps...
With respect to her $220 million in advertising?
I think we won't see that, which is both important and not the most important thing. I don't think we're going to see quite as much like private plane purchasing for various things.
Right.
I think it's, look, I want to be an optimist here. I don't get the sense that there's going to be big policy shifts outside the ones we talked about, which is this effort to kind of do a little bit less of these like video game in-your-face style enforcement actions and more spreading out in how we do that there. But I think the big changes that we're seeing currently is there seem to have been a lot of shortcuts taken in the efforts to purchase a lot of these warehouse jails. And I think they've made some announcements that flew under the radar, but they're important, I'll say. She was evidently having to approve every contract over $100,000, which I think there are some questions as to maybe why that was happening here. But I think the interesting thing ahead with the transition, I think, is going to be a lot of these contracts that were approved there. And look, just to say, part of that is there's a lot of money to be made in the atrocity business. And there's a reason that more people have tried to start to build private prisons in this country in the last year and a half. So I think there'll be some changes around there. You know, I can say I think where we've seen the most positive change so far has been big public pushback against these individual atrocities.
Well, I think I just would say that, the Trump administration, it's a character flaw that they never say, we got that wrong, we're sorry.
Yeah.
But they start to behave differently, and you can maybe read from that.
Yeah, I think I think it's an incredibly important point. I think one of the president's superpowers is he can kind of de-escalate without saying it at times.
Right. He's just never going to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Well, it's always somebody else. I think where it's always good.
That's right. Where he gets really into trouble is the things that he can't do that on here. But in this case, if they're not actually going to say, we got X, Y, and Z wrong explicitly, I think we're going to be, they're going to try different ways here. But we're going to, there's no way to expand what they're doing so much without tripping back into like really awful things. So.
That's a wrap on part 1 of this interview. Part 2 is coming out soon, and you do not want to miss it. Stay tuned, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next one.